Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show that helps you get truly well-informed by digging into the sources, the research, the core ideas.
And today, we are tackling a really big one, a fundamental question, really.
Yeah, absolutely profound. Why did human societies develop so differently across the globe over the last, say, 13,000 years?
You look around the world, even today, and see these vast inequalities, technology, political systems, just power. It varies so much.
Exactly. So the question is why? We're going to try and peel back the layers of history, kind of like an onion, to get at the surprising ultimate causes.
And our main guide for this is Jared Diamond's landmark book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's an incredibly insightful, multidisciplinary approach.
Right. So if you want a shortcut to really grasping the why behind humanity's different paths, stick around. We're diving in.
It's just fascinating how Diamond frames this question. It's one that historically many have found, well, almost too big or too controversial to tackle head on. He doesn't just describe what happened. He systematically drills down into why certain things took root in some places and not others.
Connected geography, biology, anthropology.
Exactly. All of it, to understand the historical trajectory.
And the whole thing kicks off with this amazing, provocative story. It starts back in July 1972. Diamond's on a beach in New Guinea.
Right. He was there studying bird evolution, I believe.
Yeah, and he's walking with this local politician, a really charismatic guy named Yali.
Hmm.
And Yali just stops him and asks this incredibly direct, yet incredibly complex question. He says, why is it that you white people developed so much cargo and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own?
Wow. Talk about getting straight to the point.
Right, and cargo in this context means all the manufactured goods, the technology.
The stuff. Metal tools, clothes, medicine, everything that represented the material wealth of industrialized societies.
Exactly. And Yali saw these huge disparities, as Diamond calls them, between the average New Guinean lifestyle, self-sufficient local materials, and the European or American way of life, with its seemingly endless stuff.
And these aren't just small differences. They're fundamental, basic facts of world history. Yet their origins, as Yali sensed, were, and often still are, really controversial and uncertain.
So Diamond's work, and what we're trying to do here, is essentially answer Yali, to push that question back through time, layer by layer.
Seeking the ultimate causes, not just the immediate ones.
That's the key distinction, isn't it? Because people often jump to what we call proximate causes.
Right, the immediate reasons.
I'll say, oh, it was capitalism or mercantilism or the scientific revolution or better technology or even, the impact of European diseases.
And all those things played a role, obviously. They were the means of conquest or dominance.
But they don't answer the deeper question. Why did those powerful ingredients, the advanced tech, the capitalism, the germs, arise mostly in Western Eurasia?
And not so much elsewhere or much later. That's the real puzzle. That's the onion we're peeling back.
Exactly. Moving beyond the surface explanations to the underlying conditions that made them possible in the first place.
Yeah, a reviewer called World History an onion, and it's a great analogy. The modern world is the skin. To understand it, you gotta peel back the layers.
And Diamond stresses this isn't just fascinating, it's of overwhelming importance.
Absolutely. But it's important to tackle a potential concern right away. Is this approach Eurocentric? Does it glorify Western dominance?
That's a fair question. But Diamond and our discussion actually pushes against that.
Right. A huge part of the analysis focuses on interactions between non-European peoples within Africa, Southeast Asia, the Americas.
And it makes it really clear that many basic elements of so-called Western civilization, crops, animals, technologies, were actually developed elsewhere and imported into Europe.
It's a story of global interconnectedness, not some isolated European miracle.
Plus, and this is crucial, the analysis doesn't say industrialized states are better than, say, hunter-gatherer societies.
No, it's not about ranking societies or equating history with progress towards happiness.
Diamond himself, having lived in both world's U.S. cities and New Guinea villages, talks about the mixed blessings.
Sure, modern states might offer better medicine, maybe lower homicide risk.
But traditional societies often have incredible social support, community ties, things often lost in big cities.
Exactly. So the goal here isn't judgment. It's simply to understand what happened in history, the mechanisms, the pathways that led to different outcomes.
Okay, so where do we start peeling that onion? Let's go back to the beginning, or near enough. Around 11,000 BC, end of the last ice age.
And the key point here is Everyone, everywhere was a hunter-gatherer.
A universal starting line. For the vast majority of human existence, we all lived fundamentally the same way. Foraging, hunting.
Which makes the divergences that came later even more striking, doesn't it?
Totally. So what changed? What allowed humans to spread everywhere and eventually develop such different societies? Diamond points to the Great Leap Forward.
Right, this big shift in human capabilities somewhere between, say, 100,000 and 50,000 years ago.
The exact trigger is debated, but a strong candidate is the evolution of our voice box, the anatomy for modern language.
And language is just fundamental for complex thought, planning, passing on knowledge. It unlocks creativity.
And you see the evidence pop up in the archaeology, right?
Yeah.
Especially the Cro-Magnon art in Europe.
Oh, yeah. Lascaux, Chauvet. Those cave paintings are stunning. Statues, musical instruments, too. These weren't primitive scribbles. These are modern minds at work.
And it wasn't just art. You see other big innovations, like the first real evidence of boats, watercraft capable of crossing open sea.
Which is how people got to Australia and New Guinea in the first place.
Right, and this period also coincides, kind of grimly, with the first big wave of human-caused extinctions of large animals.
Yeah, the megafauna. Australia and New Guinea lost their giant marsupials, big flightless birds, shortly after humans arrived. Africa and Eurasia, where animals co-evolved with humans longer, kept more of theirs. It suggests humans became much more efficient hunters.
Even with what seems like basic technology, these modern hunter-gatherers spread incredibly fast.
The colonization of the Americas is a prime example. From Alaska down to Patagonia, maybe 8,000 miles.
In possibly less than 1,000 years, that's like, what, 8 miles a year on average? Seems slow, but continent-wide, it's incredibly rapid.
It just shows that once humans had that modern inventiveness, that adaptability, they explored and settled most habitable places very quickly.
Okay, some extreme places like the high Arctic took longer, needing specialized tech.
Sure, thousands of years for those adaptations, but the general pattern was fast expansion.
So if everyone started as hunter-gatherers with these modern capabilities, where did the big split happen? Where did the divergence begin?
Food production. The shift from hunting and gathering to farming and herding, that's the next crucial layer.
And it wasn't like someone just woke up one day and invented farming, right?
No, not at all. It was a gradual process, emerging from countless small decisions made by foragers day after day.
Like, do I spend today gathering these wild plants? Or do I try tending this patch that might give more food later? Do I hunt or gather shellfish?
Exactly. Those daily choices, weighing immediate rewards against future payoffs, slowly, often unconsciously, tipped the balance towards cultivating certain plants and managing certain animals.
Which leads to this idea of unconscious domestication.
Yeah, it's fascinating. People weren't thinking, I'm going to genetically modify this plant. They were just gathering the ones they like best.
Take wild almonds. Most are poisonous, full of cyanide, bitter.
Right, a natural defense. But occasionally, a mutation occurs. A tree produces non-bitter, safe nuts.
And maybe some kid tries one or someone notices birds eating them.
And they realize, hey, these are good. So they gather more from that specific tree. They drop seeds near their camp, maybe even intentionally plant a few.
And over generations, the non-bitter, human-friendly version gets propagated, unconsciously selected for.
It's a brilliant example. And the same happened with other treats. People naturally preferred larger fruits, fleshier vegetables, oilier nuts like olives.
Or plants with longer fibers for making clothes, like flax or cotton.
Right, but some of the most critical changes were things early farmers wouldn't have even consciously noticed.
Like how seeds are dispersed. Wild grains often shatter easily to spread their seeds.
But humans would have preferentially harvested plants where the seeds stayed on the stalk just because it was easier. So they inadvertently selected for non-shattering varieties.
Or germination. Wild seeds might wait years to sprout, a survival strategy.
But farmers would favor seeds that sprouted reliably and quickly when planted. Again, an unconscious selection pressure shaping the plant to human needs.
So these subtle, cumulative changes were key to making agriculture more productive.
Absolutely. But here's where geography starts to play a massive role. Not all regions were equally blessed with raw materials for domestication.
You mean the wild plants themselves?
Exactly. Look at the world's 56 heaviest seeded wild grasses, the ancestors of things like wheat, barley, rice. These are the calorie powerhouses.
Okay.
An overwhelming concentration, 32 out of those 56 species, are native to the Mediterranean zone of Western Eurasia, the Fertile Crescent.
Wow. Over half in one region.
Yeah. It was just a biological jackpot for potential crops.
And we know early people there had incredible knowledge of plants. Sites like Abu Huraira in Syria.
Right, dating back 12,000 years, people there were gathering like 157 different edible plant species before full-scale farming. They knew their environment intimately.
But even with that knowledge, and even where agriculture developed independently elsewhere, the productivity wasn't always the same.
That's a crucial point. Take New Guinea. Agriculture developed there independently around 7,000 BC.
With crops like sugarcane, bananas, taro.
Yeah, and they supported dense populations, sophisticated farming systems in the highlands. Really impressive. But those indigenous crops were generally lower in protein and calories per acre compared to the fertile crescents grains, less efficient for generating large surpluses.
To the point where New Guinea Highlanders still need to carry cultivated food with them on hunting trips today.
Exactly. Hunting and gathering alone just isn't viable there anymore. The crops are essential, but not super abundant.
And the Americas, we see a lag there too, right?
A significant lag. Intensive food production, really widespread reliance on farming for calories and sedentary life, came thousands of years later than in Eurasia.
Maize, for example, took a very long time to evolve from tiny teosinte into a major staple.
Right. And then there's the huge difference in domesticated animals. This is maybe even more significant.
Eurasia had, 13 species of large domestic mammals.
14. Sheep, goats, pigs, cattle, horses, camels, donkeys, water buffalo, and so on, providing meat, milk, wool, hides.
And crucially, muscle power. Transport, warfare, pulling plows.
And manure for fertilizer, a complete package, really.
Compared to the Americas, which basically just had the dog, widely.
Pretty much. The dog was widespread, but mostly for hunting or occasional food. Then you had the turkey, guinea pig, Muscovy duck, very localized.
And the llama and alpaca in the Andes, but limited geographically and not as versatile as, say, a cow or horse.
Exactly. So why the huge disparity? Why didn't Americans or Africans or Australians domesticate more large animals?
That wasn't for lack of trying, presumably.
No. Diamond argues most wild candidates just aren't suitable. They disqualify themselves.
Like zebras. They look like horses, but
Apparently incredibly nasty, panicky, hard to manage. Grizzly bears, too dangerous, grow too slowly. Rhinos, bad attitude.
okay.
Elephants, take 15 years just to mature. Many deer species,
Sure.
too flighty, no herd structure humans can manage.
So it comes down to the available raw material again. Eurasia just happened to have more wild species with the right combination of traits, diet, growth rate, temperament, social structure.
Precisely. It wasn't about human ingenuity being different. It was about the biological resources available on each continent. And this difference in the potential for food production, both plants and animals, set the stage for everything else.
Right. It created this fundamental divergence, allowing some societies to generate surpluses far more easily.
Which leads us directly into how societies organize themselves, from these small hunter-gatherer groups to complex states.
We can sort of categorize societies, right? Though it's a spectrum. Band, tribe, chiefdom, state.
Yeah, useful shorthand. Bands are the smallest, dozens of people, nomadic, everyone's related or knows each other. Egalitarian.
Tribes are larger, hundreds, maybe settled in one village, still mostly kin-based, maybe some clans, but still pretty egalitarian.
Then you get chiefdoms. Now we're talking thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Multiple villages, often a central place, and crucially, hierarchy starts to appear.
Hereditary status, chiefs.
Right, social stratification, and then states over 50,000 up to billions. Cities, complex bureaucracy, defined classes, not based on kinship anymore, but on residency, occupation.
And a key difference emerges with chiefdoms and states. The monopoly on force.
Huge. In bands and tribes, disputes are handled informally, maybe feuds between families. No police, no army.
But in chiefdoms and states, a central authority claims the sole right to use violence to enforce laws.
Same with information. In smaller groups, knowledge is shared. In states, elites control information laws, records, trade secrets, often through specialized scribes.
And the economy changes too. Bands and tribes use reciprocity. I share my hunt today, you help me later.
Chiefdoms have tribute goods flow to the chief, who then redistributes some of it, often in feasts, to maintain power.
And states have formal taxes, resource extraction to fund the bureaucracy, the army, public works.
And you can clearly see none of this chiefdom states is possible without reliable food production. You need those surpluses.
Right. You can't have chiefs or bureaucrats or priests or specialized artisans if everyone is spending all their time just finding enough food to eat for that day.
Exactly. Surpluses feed the non-producers. They allow for big public projects than pyramids, canals.
And sedentary living is key too. You can't build pyramids if you're constantly moving. You can't accumulate complex tools or possessions.
It's why authorities, even today, when dealing with nomadic groups, always try to get them to settle down. It's about control, stability, making administration possible.
And settling down, getting bigger populations, creates new problems, right? The problem of scale.
Absolutely. Conflict resolution is a big one. In a small band, everyone's related, social pressure works.
Like those New Guineans Diamond mentions relatives step in to stop fights escalating.
But in a society of thousands of strangers, kin-based resolution breaks down. You need a central authority, laws, enforcement. Otherwise, it just descends into chaos. Feuds everywhere.
And decision-making. How does a group of 10,000 people decide anything by consensus?
You can't. It's impossible. Even small village meetings can be tough. Large societies require structured, centralized decision-making. Hierarchy becomes necessary.
Which then leads to another driver, competition between these groups.
Right. Societies don't evolve in isolation. They compete. Tribes conquer or merge to form chiefdoms. Chiefdoms battle it out, forming states. States expand into empires.
Like the Cherokee example, they were separate chiefdoms.
Until pressure from white settlers forced them to unify into a single confederacy for survival, external threat drove centralization.
And many states formed primarily through conquest, sometimes without a big tech advantage initially.
Think of the Zulus under Shaka. Their advantage wasn't guns or germs. It was superior military organization, discipline, and a unifying ideology imposed by Shaka that allowed them to build an empire.
Or the Aztecs, the Incas, states in Hawaii, Tahiti. Many formed through internal conquest before Europeans even showed up. Superior organization and ideology could be decisive.
So food production enables denser populations and sedentary life, which creates problems of scale solved by centralized organization, which is often driven by competition and conquest.
Okay, so that's the societal structure. Now let's get to the immediate tools, the proximate causes. Guns, germs, and steel, plus writing. Let's start with germs, the silent killers.
Their impact is just staggering and often underestimated. And the link to domesticated animals is fundamental.
That anecdote Diamond tells about the guy and the sheep. Kind of disturbing, but it makes the point vividly.
It really does. Living closely with livestock for thousands of years created this cauldron for disease evolution. Pathogens jumped from animals to humans.
Smallpox from cowpox, measles from cattle plague, flu from pigs and ducks.
Whooping cough from pigs or dogs, maybe TB from cattle. Our farms were incubators for human epidemics.
And these diseases, the acute epidemic ones, have specific traits, right?
Yeah, they spread fast, make you acutely ill, you die or recover relatively quickly. Survivors often get immunity, and they tend to become human-only diseases.
Which is why they were so devastating when introduced to populations with no previous exposure. The virgin soil epidemic.
Exactly. Europeans arrived in the Americas or Australia carrying this invisible arsenal of diseases that they themselves had some resistance to from centuries of exposure.
But the indigenous populations had no immunity, no genetic resistance built up over generations.
So these diseases just ripped through them. Smallpox, measles, influenza. They could wipe out 90% or more of a population in some cases.
Yeah.
Entire villages, tribes decimated.
Like those Sadlermite Eskimos in 1902, one sick sailor brings dysentery, kills almost everyone.
It's horrifying. And because these populations were often smaller and more isolated, the disease might burn itself out locally, but not before causing immense damage. And they couldn't sustain their own crowd diseases to give back.
So the Eurasian germ advantage was terrifyingly effective. But you mentioned a difference between New Guinea and Australia.
Yeah, it's a really interesting contrast. In New Guinea, Europeans faced local diseases too, like malaria. But also, New Guineans had actually acquired some resistance to Eurasian germs over time. Through about 3,500 years of contact with Austronesian settlers and traders coming from Southeast Asia who brought diseases from the Asian mainland with them. It wasn't full immunity, but it was something.
Which helped New Guinea remain largely populated by New Guineans.
It certainly contributed. Australia was different. Aboriginal Australians were much more isolated for much longer.
So no opportunity to build immunity or evolve resistance.
None. So when Europeans arrived in 1788, the diseases hit with full force. Smallpox, flu, measles, TB, syphilis. Mass death followed very quickly. It was a biological catastrophe that paved the way for conquest.
Chilling. Okay, let's move to technology. The guns and steel. We often think of invention as these lone geniuses. Watt, Edison.
A heroic theory, yeah. But Diamond argues it's much more cumulative. Technology builds on itself.
And often the main uses for invention are found after it's invented.
That's often the case. Watt's steam engine was for pumping water out of mines.
But then it revolutionized factories, trains, ships, things he probably didn't initially foresee.
Exactly. So societies that get an earlier start on this cumulative process tend to accelerate faster. Each invention opens doors for more inventions.
And Eurasia had a massive head start. Why?
Several factors. Biggest landmass, most diverse environments, most competing societies pushing each other.
Plus the earliest centers of food production, providing the surplus to support inventors and craft people.
And critically, that east-west axis. Innovations could spread relatively easily across similar climates.
So crops, animals, farming techniques, metallurgy, writing they could diffuse across thousands of miles in Eurasia relatively quickly.
Compared to, say, Australia and New Guinea, they remained largely stone tool users until Europeans arrived, despite having mineral resources.
Why the lag there?
Primarily because they remained mostly hunter-gatherers, lacked the large, dense, specialized populations needed for complex tech like metallurgy.
And Australia's environment dry, infertile, limited population size overall. Fewer people means fewer potential inventors, less demand.
Plus geographic isolation, ideas didn't diffuse in easily. They didn't have that cumulative buildup.
And when technologies do meet, diffusion can be brutal, like the musket wars in New Zealand.
Oh yeah, a stark example. One tribe, the Ngāpuhi, gets muskets from Europeans around 1818. Suddenly they have a massive advantage.
And for the next 15 years, it's chaos. Other Maori tribes either desperately scramble to get muskets themselves, or they get conquered.
The technology forces its own adoption through sheer military necessity. It spread throughout New Zealand purely through warfare and the threat of it.
But sometimes societies actually reject technology. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but it happens. Japan famously restricted firearms for over 2 centuries under the Tokugawa shogunate. They preferred swords.
Until Commodore Perry showed up in 1853 and basically forced them to reconsider.
Pretty much. Their isolation allowed them to make that choice, but once isolation ended, the tech became unavoidable.
China too, right? They abandoned huge ocean-going ships after Genghis voyages.
Yeah, and sophisticated clocks, water-powered machines. Sometimes unity and central control can stifle innovation if the leadership decides against a particular path. Less internal competition.
And there are even more extreme cases. Tasmanians abandoning bone tools and fishing.
Yes, after being isolated by rising sea levels, some Polynesians abandoned pottery. Some Arctic and Melanesian groups gave up boats or kayaks. It shows progress isn't guaranteed. Technology can be lost if it's not needed or if there's no competition.
And metallurgy itself is a great example of cumulative development. You don't just jump to iron.
No way. It took thousands of years. First, using native copper and gold, then figuring out pottery kilns, which led to smelting copper ores, then bronze making, which needs lower temperatures than iron.
Iron requires really high temperatures, advanced furnaces.
Exactly. In Eurasia, iron came after about 2,000 years of bronze working. When Europeans reached the Americas, the most advanced metallurgists, mainly in the Andes, were just starting with bronze. No iron yet.
Another huge technological gap.
Absolutely, which gave invaders a massive advantage in weapons and tools.
Okay, so that's guns and steel. What about the power of information writing?
Immensely valuable. For administration, sending complex messages accurately over distance and time, keeping records, planning.
So again, why did only some societies develop it? And why at such different times? Sumerians versus, say, Mesoamericans.
It seems strongly linked to the rise of those complex societies, chiefdoms, and especially states. Writing appears to be almost essential for managing large populations, economies, bureaucracies.
Keeping track of taxes, laws, tribute, granaries.
All of that. It solves administrative problems that arise with scale.
But was it invented multiple times independently? Or did the idea spread?
That's a big debate. Sumerian cuneiform in Mesopotamia seems to be the earliest, developing gradually. But Egyptian hieroglyphs appear quite suddenly around 3000 BC, not far away.
Suggesting maybe they got the idea from the Sumerians, even if the symbols were different.
It's plausible, same for early scripts in Iran, Crete, Turkey. Perhaps the concept diffused even if the specific systems were local inventions.
And then there's that bizarre Phaistos disc from Crete.
Ah, yes, from around 1700 BC. Undeciphered script, unique symbols.
But the crazy part is that it was made using stamps, like movable type.
Exactly. The earliest printed document in the world, by millennia, Someone had a set of maybe 45 stamps they used to impress the clay.
Why didn't that technology take off? Why did printing presses take thousands more years?
It's a mystery. It shows invention can be quirky, isolated. Maybe the conditions weren't right for its adoption then. It challenges simple ideas about inevitable progress.
And how writing was used also varied, right? Early alphabetic scripts.
Like Greek or early Roman often show up first on things like wine jugs, pottery, graffiti, personal messages, poems, ownership marks.
So starting with private use and only later getting adopted for official state business.
Often, yes. Kind of the reverse of the earlier systems like cuneiform or hieroglyphs, which seem to have been invented for state administration from the start.
Interesting. So we have germs, technology, writing, all shaped by these deeper factors. Which brings us squarely back to geography, doesn't it? Especially continental shape.
Yes, the orientation of the continent's main axes. This is a really powerful yet simple explanation for a lot of the divergence.
Eurasia's main axis is east-west, a huge advantage,
Massive. It stretches 8,000 miles, mostly at similar latitudes.
meaning similar climates, day lengths, vegetation zones.
Exactly. So a crop domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, like wheat, could spread relatively easily east and west across Europe and Asia because the conditions were suitable. It didn't need major adaptation.
Animals too, presumably. Horses, cattle.
Yes. And technologies related to farming or metallurgy or writing could diffuse along these routes, connecting societies and similar environments. It facilitated rapid spread across a vast area.
Now contrast that with Africa and the Americas. Their main axes are north-south.
Right. And traveling north-south means crossing drastically different climate zones.
So those Fertile Crescent crops hit a wall in Africa, south of Ethiopia,
Yep.
tropical conditions they couldn't handle.
Precisely. A huge barrier. It forced Africans south of the Sahara to independently domesticate entirely different sets of crops suited to tropical climates, like sorghum and yams, a separate and somewhat later agricultural revolution.
And the Americas. Similar problem with north-south spread.
Yes, compounded by geographical bottlenecks like the Isthmus of Panama and major ecological barriers like deserts and rainforests and high mountains.
Making it much harder for crops, animals, or technologies developed in, say, Mexico to reach Peru, or vice versa.
Much harder. Diffusion was slower, more difficult. Things that arose in one center didn't spread as readily across the continents. This slowed down the whole process compared to Eurasia.
But humans still managed incredible journeys. The Austronesian expansion. That's mind-blowing.
Isn't it? Starting from Taiwan around 3500 BC, these people spread across the Pacific, colonizing islands thousands of miles apart, reaching as far as Easter Island and Hawaii and even
Madagascar. Off the coast of Africa.
yeah, settled by people from Borneo, Indonesia. Diamond calls it the single most astonishing fact of human geography. It's like finding Swedes in Cuba when Columbus arrived.
How did they do it? What was the key?
Technology, specifically the invention of the double outrigger sailing canoe.
More stable than a simple dugout. Allowed for open ocean voyages.
Absolutely. Stable enough to carry people, animals like pigs and chickens, root crops like taro and yams, their whole Neolithic package across vast distances. It was a breakthrough in maritime tech.
And we can trace this expansion through language and archaeology.
Unmistakably. The linguistic diversity points back to Taiwan as the origin. The archaeology shows their distinctive pottery, tools, and domesticated species spreading out stage by stage.
That Madagascar settlement just boggles the mind, though, across the whole Indian Ocean.
It implies incredible seamanship and long-distance navigation, perhaps involving coastal hopping via India and East Africa. We see hints in loanwords and even musical instruments.
Wow. Okay, another big expansion was the Bantu in Africa.
Yes, originating in West Africa near Cameroon and Nigeria around 3000 BC, Bantu-speaking farmers spread south and east over millennia.
Displacing or absorbing the earlier inhabitants, the Pygmies and Khoisan peoples.
Largely, yes. Their advantage was agriculture crops, like yams, later cattle and cereals suited to drier climates. This allowed them to support much denser populations than the hunter-gatherers or pastoralists they encountered.
More people generally means a military advantage.
It does. Though the process wasn't instant conquest, it involved leapfrogging, settling fertile areas first, trading, intermarrying, but the long-term demographic pressure was key. Bantu farmers eventually occupied most of sub-Saharan Africa.
So pulling it all together, these deep environmental factors, the plants, the animals, the continental axes, the barriers they shaped where food production took off most effectively.
Right. And that, in turn, influenced population density, which drove the development of technology, political organization, and even germs.
Leading to the differences in the immediate tools of conquest, The guns, germs, and steel that Europeans, for instance, possessed by 1500 AD.
It's a long chain of cause and effects, stretching back thousands of years.
But it wasn't always a perfect correlation, right? The Incas had a huge empire, but no full writing.
Exactly. Or the Aztecs had writing but lacked the really devastating Eurasian diseases. The Zulu state rose on organization, not tech.
So the factors interacted but didn't always line up perfectly. Each contributed, but ultimately stemmed from those deeper geographical roots.
Which raises the question of, well, what about culture? Or individual genius? Are they just noise in this big picture?
Diamond calls them history's wildcards. Minor cultural quirks can become fixed, like the QWERTY keyboard.
Designed to be inefficient, but it's stuck. Inertia can be powerful. And these seemingly small things can sometimes influence bigger choices later on.
And what about the great man theory of history? Hitler, Alexander, Buddha, Shaka. Did they truly change the course, or were they just products of their time?
Diamond seems to lean more towards the idea that individuals often ride the waves of deeper historical forces. Bismarck's idea of hearing God's footsteps marching through history.
So maybe the individual's genius lies in recognizing and seizing the moment created by those larger forces, rather than creating the forces themselves.
Perhaps. It's debatable, of course. But the broad patterns seem driven by factors larger than any single person.
Which connects to thinking about history as a science. It's not like chemistry, you can't run controlled experiments.
No, you can't rerun the Roman Empire with slightly different variables. Historical sciences like astronomy or evolutionary biology rely on observation, comparison, and natural experiments.
Comparing continents, islands, societies with different starting conditions, looking for patterns.
Exactly. You can't predict the specifics, maybe not the next election result.
But you can predict broad patterns over long timescales. Like, you can't predict the sex of your next baby, but you can predict the sex ratio in 1,000 births pretty accurately.
Right. The individual variations average out, revealing underlying tendencies. That's how we can identify these deep historical forces.
And these forces from the deep past have a heavy hand on the present, don't they? Modern inequality.
There's strong economic evidence for this now. Studies show that countries in regions with long histories of agriculture and state societies tend to be richer today, even controlling for other factors.
That historical head start still matters.
Seems so. Partly it's about having good institutions, experienced administration, market traditions that developed over centuries, but even beyond that, there's a residual effect of deep history.
Wow. So the past is really present.
In profound ways.
Okay, one last fascinating concept, the optimal fragmentation principle.
Ah, yes, the idea that innovation might flourish best when there's intermediate political fragmentation.
Like Europe's history, lots of competing states.
Exactly. That competition spurred innovation. Columbus gets rejected by one king, he shops his idea around to others until someone bites.
Whereas in a unified empire like China, a single no from the top could kill an idea completely. Like stopping the treasure fleets.
Plausibly, yes. Unity can bring stability, but might stifle competition and risk-taking. But too much fragmentation, like maybe ancient India, could also hinder things by preventing cooperation or widespread adoption.
So there's a sweet spot. Enough competition to drive innovation, enough connection to spread it.
That seems to be the argument, at least for technological innovation.
But importantly, that fragmentation might not be optimal for, say, preventing wars or ensuring stability.
Definitely not. Europe's history is full of incredibly destructive wars born from that very fragmentation. World Wars I and II being prime examples. There are always trade-offs.
So, wrapping this all up, after peeling back all those layers, what's the core takeaway?
I think it's that the vast differences in wealth and power we see today aren't really about inherent differences between peoples. They're not about biology or intelligence.
But about the legacy of geography and environment, the different starting materials and opportunities available on different continents thousands of years ago.
Exactly. The availability of domestical plants and animals, the ease of diffusion along continental axes, these set different regions on fundamentally different trajectories very early on.
That hand of history's course at 8000 BC lies heavily on us.
It's a powerful summary. It explains, without resorting to prejudice, why Yali asked his question, why the cargo was distributed so unevenly.
And understanding that deep history is crucial, isn't it? For tackling inequality today, for understanding global politics.
Absolutely. It gives us a framework for understanding the root causes, realizing that historical and environmental legacies still shape opportunities and challenges for different nations and regions.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, our listeners, to chew on.
If these deep geographical and environmental advantages from millennia ago created the world map of inequality we largely still see,
What does that mean for our globalized future? Are we escaping that heavy hand of history? Or are its patterns still subtly shaping our world, maybe in ways we don't always recognize, like in climate vulnerability, resource access, or even cultural attitudes shaped by long-term stability or instability?
are there still deep currents flowing beneath the surface of our interconnected world? Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about. That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.